Welcome to the I'm Book podcast. I'm April O'Leary, and this is the YouTube version of our podcast. To get the audio version, you can hop on over to Spotify or anywhere that you consume audio podcasts. We are going to jump into some really cool content, so stay tuned for our next guest. We look forward to connecting with you, and be sure to subscribe. And to start your author adventure, hop on over to o'learypublishing.com, where you can map out the entire process and see what writing a book would look like for you. Let's get started. Welcome back to the I'm Book podcast. I'm April O'Leary, the founder of O'Leary Publishing, and today I am so excited. We have Jeffrey Shaw on with us, who is the author of The Self-Employed Life, and he is amongst the top 15% of all podcasts for his podcast, which is also called The Self-Employed Life. So welcome to the show as a guest on a podcast. How does that feel?
It's kind of fun being on the other side of the mic. You don't have to do all that research. But thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's interesting. Right before we started this recording, we were talking about how did we get connected? And, being a podcast host, as he knows as well, you get guests that come from all different directions. And we figured out that we most likely connected through LinkedIn. And LinkedIn is just a really nice place to find like-minded people. And so I'm really glad to be here with you today, talking about book writing and branding and the self-employed life. So let's talk a bit about you as a self-employed photographer, portrait photographer, for how many years? 35 years?
38, actually. I mean, I still, at this point, I do, this year I'll do maybe 6 shoots. Like I'm doing very, very little photography. I've been kind of phasing out of it for 15 years. It's just taken me a really long time to let go of people that I had such long-term relationships with. But yeah, it's actually my 38th year of being, I started obviously very, very young. But yeah, it's my 38th year of being a photographer.
I was going to say, my goodness, were you born with the camera in your hand?
Well, that's nice of you, but not quite.
So your journey as a self-employed portrait photographer 38 years ago, let's talk about like the early days of having your business. What did you do to find clients and start building?
Well, and if you were to ask me, 15 years ago, why I was on this planet, I would have said to be a portrait photographer. Like that was I thought my life's work. But what we realize as we go through this journey of entrepreneurship and we reflect back, and I think we can only connect the dots in hindsight. Like it's really hard to connect the dots when they're being laid out as stepping stones in front of you. But in hindsight, you can kind of connect them. And for me, being a portrait photographer for all those decades, turns out it was more of the learning lab of everything that I'm able to teach others today. Because the portrait photography business in itself is such an unusual business. For one, like I always say, and my clientele, by the way, were very, very affluent. So I had a very unique business. So I was kind of the family photographer for very affluent families. And you realize at some point that I'm selling something nobody needs to the hardest market in the world. But what that did is it really fine-tuned my ability to figure out how to do that. I came from a very lower middle class upbringing, but here I ended up being this photographer for very affluent families. And really it was an in-depth study of who they are, and which resulted in my first book, which came out in 2018 called Lingo. And Lingo tells the story of how I went from this humble beginnings to serving this clientele. But it's also a strategy. It's the strategy of brand messaging. It's the strategy of speaking people's lingo, which I refer to as when you speak someone's lingo, you're speaking so much to their heart that it's as if you're sharing a secret language. It's sort of like lingo is like speaking the unspoken word. And when you can do that for people, that's what makes them feel really connected. So to me, my entire entrepreneurial journey can be wrapped up as it is today and how I teach other people is how to really, really get to know the people that you serve in ways that you touch their emotions. As I teach my students in the Self-Employed Business Institute, my goal is to help everybody market their business in a way that their customers say, wow, it's like you're in my head. That should be the goal of marketing, not know, like, and trust. I always say know, like, and trust is too low of a bar, right? But to get people to feel like, wow, it's like you're in my head. You know my head and my heart so well. That should be what we aspire to accomplish in everything we do, in how we market our businesses and including the books that we write.
Mm,
right? The greatest compliment I ever receive as an author, and I know you'll relate to this, is when somebody says, wow, I was reading your book and I could hear your voice in my head.
yeah.
That to me is the ultimate compliment. Sure, they're going to hear my voice on the audiobook, but to read the book and to actually feel, especially for podcast listeners, people that listen to us on our podcast and then read our books and make the connection that it feels like the same person, that to me
Yeah.
is the ultimate goal.
Yeah. So how did you, growing up in not in the affluent world that you ended up serving, how did you teach yourself that lingo? How did you discover what the lingo was for the affluent market that you wanted to serve? Did you find that you somehow chose your market? I want to be a portrait photographer for affluent people and I'm going to learn the lingo, or is it something you fell into and you learned along the way?
I'd say it was something that kind of unfolded in front of
Mm,
me. So first of all, I have a fundamental belief in business that there's a world of people waiting for you to show up,
mm,
right? Because so often we're trying to make ourselves show up or putting ourselves. So what it took was a bit of failure. So I struggled for 3 years because when I got out of photography school, I went back to my hometown. Seems to make sense, right? You go back to the place you know. But I struggled there for 3 years, ultimately realized that I was barking up the wrong tree. Like this was not a market that was ever going to appreciate what I had to offer. And what I realized was the values difference.
mm,
So it started for me first seeing a huge disconnect in what I valued and what the people in my hometown valued or wanted to value. What I
mhm.
mean by that is that I innately have always had a value for very long-term thinking. I've had life insurance since I was 19 years old. Everything have ever done has always been thinking about the future. And it was a big driver as to why I became a photographer, particularly a portrait photographer, because I wanted to create portraits that were so beautiful, they hung on the wall as art, and they got handed down from generation to generation, and they capture those special moments in people's lives. So I was selling my portraiture through the lens of long-term thinking,
Mm,
I finally realized means nothing to people who don't know if they can pay their rent that month,
right.
right? So that unfolded to me thinking, well, who in the world is waiting for me to show up? Like who does think long term? And I realized, well, people with discretionary income can afford to think long term.
Hmm.
Problem is, I knew nothing about people with discretionary income, whatever that meant. I just knew it was an audience that would likely appreciate what I had to offer and would value what I valued. So I
Mm,
took it upon myself. I gave myself 3 months to study the behavior of affluent people. So what I did is I lived outside of New York City. So I went into New York City and I spent time at high-end restaurants, high-end retailers. And I studied not so much the brands, but I studied what if I were them or if I were they, what would emotionally trigger me?
mm,
Like, what would make me buy that? What makes me choose that brand? I literally walked in their shoes and imagined if I were an affluent person, why is that speaking to me? And for example, one thing I noticed immediately when I went to these high end stores is that the most successful brands were built on somebody's name, especially in the 80s, designer names. My photography business had been like a cliche photography name. I immediately changed it to my name and I then set forward a plan to build out a brand based on my name. So my clients felt like they were hiring the designer of photographers.
right.
Okay. So it's things like that. So I really unpacked the psychology of the market. And then I flipped it around and said, okay, now that I understand them, I can speak their lingo. So then I rechanged my branding, all my messaging, and just really stepped into speaking their lingo. So they felt like it wasn't that I built a business and waited for them to show up. I built a business that they felt was built for them. And it was a
Mm,
natural synchronization. And my business, when I got that idea, kind of relaunched, rebranded, just a couple of hours away in Connecticut, which rumor had there's a state that had more money than where I grew up. So, because like I said, I knew nothing about what I was stepping into.
right.
I had heard that there was money in Connecticut. So I relaunched in Connecticut. And within not less than a year, my business multiplied 5 times.
Mm.
So now I had a ball rolling. And then from that point on, it just took off really quickly.
It's interesting. that you say that your hometown was the most logical place to start, which it is for most people.
Right.
And yet, sometimes you have to leave your hometown, leave the people who know you one
Yeah.
way, and then show up somewhere else. And now you don't have all those. Well, I knew Jeffrey back when he was, and now he thinks he's such and such, right?
Yeah.
So you went to where you felt that your target market would be, and you showed up camera in hand with
Yeah.
your brand new branding, and look what happened in a year.
Yeah.
So it really is interesting to think about. One thing I thought you were going to say, in high-end stores, we have a mall very close to where I live that has all the Louis Vuitton store, and they've got the red velvet rope out front and the guy in the suit. There's a Tiffany store, and when you go in, you don't see signs that say flash sale, 50% off.
Yeah.
You don't see any of those things you're going to see at TJ Maxx, because people who shop in there,
No,
they're not there because
that's
they're going to get a
exactly.
deal.
And that's the lingo, right? The lingo, that's the psychology behind lingo, is that, for example, in my photography business, I would never talk about discounting, but I could offer things as long as it was called an upgrade,
Mhm.
right? So same thing with, I always laugh about the, exclusive lounges at airports. Honestly, the hook is the free food, right?
Mhm.
Which is to a clientele that doesn't need the free food,
Right.
but it's just the luxury of having the free food and the free water. So it's, yeah, there's all those subtleties. There's the subtleties of detail. With one of the things we did in my photography business is we produced really high-end holiday cards, because communicating via holiday card is very important to this clientele. Again, not something I knew. My family didn't send out Christmas cards, but this clientele, it's very important to send out kind of an annual connection, and they often do that through a holiday card. And they were all custom done. They were beautiful, and they averaged about $10 a card. And we're talking about a
Mhm.
clientele that would send out 500 to 1,000 Christmas cards.
Mhm.
So it's a substantial investment in a holiday card. What mattered the most to them was the fact that after these beautifully custom designed cards were made, we would also give them a really nice felt tip pen, that the color of the pen closely matched the color of the ink of the return address on the envelope. Because this is a clientele that every I has to be dotted and every T has to be crossed, and they want to make sure they always come across very detailed. They may not have thought of that, but the fact that I thought of it and gave them this $2.50 pen with their $10,000 in holiday cards,
Mhm.
that silly pen meant the world to them. But I
Mhm.
also knew, again, they weren't a clientele that would allow something to look sloppy. So either they or somebody on their staff would have been running around town looking for this pen. Similarly, like when we would take their order for their holiday cards, we would give them the choices of the stamps available for that season from the U.S.
Mhm.
Postal Service, and they would pay for their stamps. We wouldn't stamp the envelopes, but we would buy the stamps for them online, and this way, when they got the card, they already had the stamps. Why? Because they don't want to waste time, or quite honestly, probably the time of their nanny, to stand in line at the post office.
Right.
Things like that's lingo. Like that is when you know what makes your clientele tick to
Mhm.
such an extreme that you're steps ahead of them. Whether it's affluent, and it's true of any market. Walmart has a very strong lingo, so
Mhm.
let's not be mistaken. It's not just the high end. Walmart knows exactly who they're speaking to,
Mhm.
right? It's very discount driven, rollback pricing. They are speaking the lingo of cost conscious people, and that's
Mhm.
fine, but they're doing it 100%. They're not somewhere in between. They are
Right.
speaking the lingo of their customers.
It's so interesting. A couple of years back, my uncle Roger, who is in the affluent target market, I would say, I was talking to him. He's worked in high-end retail. He loves everything to look. He's always got his pressed pants, all of that. And he has never been to a Walmart. I was flabbergasted. Like, what? You've
It's not in
never
his
been to a
sphere,
Walmart?
right? Yeah, it's just not in his sphere. And
It's
so the other one of the brands I think really I think speaks the lingo really well is Target. Now, if you ever
yes,
notice, Target and Walmart are almost always right down the street from one another.
yes.
That's intentional because they're carving out different parts of the audience in the air in the community. And Target very much speaks, whereas Walmart is a cost conscious clientele, Target is speaking value conscious, right?
Mhm.
Target shoppers will spend money. It's why you go for one thing and you leave with a cart full.
Hmm.
Target shoppers will absolutely spend money. They just have to believe they're getting more value for than what they're spending.
Right.
Right. So these are the brands that, again, I ended up over the decades I've been doing this, really studying across the board that successful brands and businesses have carved out the lingo they want to speak to a specific audience. The worst place to be is in this gray area that people don't know who you're talking to or if you're talking to them. But it's
Right.
not just true of the high end, and it's all. That's what I love about teaching lingo is that I can say it is flexible enough that it can fit any industry in any market. You just have to understand the lingo of the people you're trying to serve. And that includes readers. Like I said, I go back to writing books and how much my business experience taught me as an author because I look at my readers the same way. I have to understand them and speak their lingo. My editor and I often in debates like, we know what's grammatically correct, but nobody says it that way. Like who and whom. Like I know
Right.
where you're supposed to use whom, but nobody speaks that way. Like not my people, because I'm
Right.
not I'm not writing for the uber sophisticated grammar police. I'm
Right.
writing for business people that just want to get to the point. Right?
Yes.
So it's a very similar component to me as an author.
Yeah. So your book Lingo, which came out in 2018,
Correct.
was largely driven by your ability to understand the lingo of your clientele over all those years in photography. So, but your audience shifted because
Yes.
you went from I'm photographing affluent people who want their stamps and they want their felt tip pen to match their cards and all of that to I'm going to serve business employed business people who are maybe like me, maybe they're not photographers, but they have their own business. They want to understand who their client is. And so your book Lingo was born. How did you get the idea to shift from running your own business, doing what you were doing successfully to like, I need to write a book to really help people understand how to do what I did?
Yeah. So I had been speaking in the photo industry as a successful leader in that industry. I was being called upon to speak quite often. So I was speaking at and there are way more than most people would realize. There are a lot of photography associations. There's a national association called the Professional Photographers of America. Then it's broken up by states and regions and chapters. So there's a lot of speaking opportunities, and I was speaking at many of those. And but I was a unique speaker in that I wasn't teaching posing and lighting and the things that all the other photography teachers were talking about. I was actually teaching them how to make money at what they do. Because the reason I was successful as a photographer is, to me, the camera in the end of the day, I loved the art of it, but at the end of the day, the camera was a vehicle to build relationships with interesting people for me.
Mm. Yeah.
So that kept my business head in the right place. And that is what enabled me to be successful. I often refer to it as the dirty little secret of creative businesses is that people that are highly successful in creative businesses, they like what they do, but they're not so driven by the passion of the art that they hate business. They actually see their creativity as a vehicle for something bigger. So as I was about speaking in photography, I was talking about business in much broader concepts, and people like the caterers, the hotel managers, they were coming up to me after my talks and saying, everything you're talking about has nothing to do with photography. I'm like, I know. So that woke me up to realizing there was a bigger world for me. And so when I wrote Lingo, I often refer to it as my calling out card, not a business card, because a book is way more than a business card. Like I never looked at it as just a vehicle for a business card. I looked at it more as a calling out card. It was my time to build a platform and make a statement that what I had to teach through books and other practices was bigger than the photo industry. So I wrote a book that leveraged my story as a photographer, but spoke the business lessons to a much broader audience so that people in all
Yes.
industries, right, could appreciate it. If you were, in 2018, I would say that book was, or my work was for entrepreneurs in the broad sense that entrepreneurship is. 3 years later, when I wrote The Self-Employed Life, is when I kind of honed in. It's like, well, I don't want to just serve entrepreneurs. More specifically, who I care most about are self-employed people, which is
Yes.
different than entrepreneurship.
Mhm.
Entrepreneurs, it's so broad that nowadays, first of all, when you call yourself an entrepreneur, it can sound like you're in between jobs. I mean, it can have a different connotation to it, but it also
Right.
can, right? But it also can be like the business you're building to sell, which is
Hmm.
okay. But by and large, most self-employed businesses are built by people who are looking to create enough income from their business to provide the lifestyle they want.
Right.
May or may not be saleable. So those are the people I'm most deeply passionate about, the people that are pouring their heart and their soul into a type of business that provides the income they want to live the life they want and is changing other people's lives. They don't actually go into the business initially thinking I'm going to build it to sell it.
Right.
So that's why I honed in on my second book, serving self-employed business owners with the self-employed life, and not just the business practices, but how do you get the life that you are striving for out of this self-employed business?
So what was your experience launching your first book? Let's talk about that.
Well, my first book was self-published, which I do, you know, it was a good way to test everything. My second book is with a hybrid publisher. But I am kind of an in the trenches guy. So it was okay to self-publish the first book because it
Yeah.
helped me understand what needed to be done.
Right.
Um,
And
I'd say that.
when you say you self-publish it,
Mhm.
because just to clarify, around here we talk about all kinds of publishing and
Yeah,
routes to it. And a lot of times I explain the difference between traditional publishing where, you work with a literary agent, you try to sell your book
right.
proposal or manuscript in, and then under the umbrella of independent publishing, which would mean not traditional, there's self, meaning you did all of it yourself from sourcing all of the editorial help and all the design help and all that to sort of the vanity press, which is a little bit more, a little bit more hands-on, but I would say less rigorous in the editorial department. And then the hybrid, as you said, is sort of that top
Right.
tier of independence. So for
Yep.
self-publishing for you, was that like, I got to figure this out myself?
So I definitely felt like the contractor hiring all the subcontractors, right?
Right.
So, but I fortunately had a relationship with my editor who she's just brilliant, and she also knew tons about the publishing process. So she was an
That's
incredible
great.
guide to me,
Yeah.
right? So that helped. Um, the couple things that took me by surprise, and I try to now pass this on to other authors, is that for once you have to start so much earlier than you think, not just in the writing but also the runway to make a book successful is much longer than I had anticipated, to the point where with my first book I recognized that I wanted to be on a lot of podcasts. Being a podcast host myself, I know the power of it. But at the time that I'm pitching myself to get on podcasts, I didn't have a book that was in a form that I could send to the podcast host yet.
Mhm.
So I was way behind in that. But I wound up coming up with a solution to that ended up being a stroke of brilliance. And I now intentionally did it with my second book was, I mean, I literally, here I am trying to I'm pitching myself and trying to get on podcasts, but I don't have a book to send them. So
Right.
what I did is I created a 20-page summary of the book
Yeah.
based on what was done. And I was sending, and most podcast hosts actually loved that because as a podcast host myself, I read every book,
Yeah.
but that's rare. I mean, most podcast hosts aren't reading every book. I read every book of every author. Providing them with a 20-page summary gave them enough meat of the book that they could develop their questions without giving them a list of questions that might be repeated in interview after interview, but it
Right.
also saved them a lot of time. So that was kind of the way I fixed the first book. Now, the second book, I did that intentionally. Even though the book was done, I now was sending the podcast host the completed PDF as well as a 32-page summary of that book
Mhm.
and giving them a choice of which they
Right.
could do. So one thing that stood out to me in publishing the first book is I didn't have nearly enough runway. The second was, and being a business coach and the founder of the Self-Employed Business Institute and caring so much about the business side, I'm always trying to make the point of what is the back end intention of the business,
Yes.
right?
Thank you.
I did,
Thank
yeah.
you.
I didn't go into that idea with my first book, Lingo. I was fortunate that people were reading the book and contacting me and saying, I would love for you to redo all my marketing brand messaging. And I'm like, okay. I'll come up with, I mean, I had been a coach for years, but I was used to being like, a 1 year, one-to-one business coach. Suddenly people wanted a short fix. They said, can I hire you, work with you for a month or two? You redo our brand messaging. So I instantaneously had to create something to fill that need, which ended up being a huge financial maker for me, particularly during the pandemic when everything else shut down.
Right.
That was the thing everybody was doing. It carried my whole business.
Mm.
So then now with the self-employed life, I went into the back end with more intention. And I thought I created a kind of a 3-month coaching. And after even working with just a few clients, I realized there was a bigger need, which is what initiated the founding of the Self-Employed Business Institute, because people were reading this very chock full book of business strategies and then reaching out and saying, I want more. I want to understand how to do this more. And I realized there was a huge opportunity to create a scalable educational program that was 5 months long that would really give an in-depth teachings of what I taught in the book. So that's one thing I would tell everybody. So even if, for one, have a plan for your back-end services up front, also be open, as I always am in business, as I said earlier, to follow what's unfolding, because often your best opportunities are unfolding in front of you. I thought I was prepared with the second book with a specific 3-month coaching program, but I real quickly realized people wanted more, and it became a 5-month business institute.
Right.
But whatever it is, just be prepared for what you can do with the book, and understand that if you've written a good book, your readers want more from you.
Yes. I love that. I absolutely love that you said that, because it's something that I feel like I preach all the time. My very first book, which I wrote in 2012, I had no idea I'd be running a publishing company. It was not the
Right.
intention. I was a
Yeah.
life coach. I was doing, little workshops and whatevers. And then I got through my life coach mentor. He had an XM radio show, and I ended up guest producing for it because his guest producer left it. I didn't even know what that meant. And, it was like, so I ended up booking all these authors because it was an all positive talk radio show. And that was his one criteria, that anyone I booked had to have a book.
Mm.
So it was that light bulb moment, like, oh, well, then if I have a book, right?
Yep.
It's not like you have to have a book that sold 1 million copies.
Yeah.
You just have to have the book, so that that also presented itself with the challenge and the opportunity to self-publish, which I did for my very first book because I didn't know anything about anything, which then led to doing the same thing, an 8-week course and a workbook and a journal and a couple conferences. And so that book, while I cannot tell you it did not sell 1 million copies, it didn't probably even sell 1,000, who knows, but it did open the door to so many other things.
Yeah.
And for you, with Lingo and the self-employed life, to see all that's unfolding is really exciting.
Yeah.
So
No, I've made far more money. I mean, not even comparable on the services after the book than the book itself.
right.
And I think there's a delicate balance. I think, as a podcast host, because I read every book, I can smell the books that aren't written. I should say that differently. I can smell the books that are written with too much of an intention of the back end. Like, I feel like I'm reading a flyer.
Yeah.
Right? You don't want that.
Right.
You have to develop a book that provides exceptional value, changes people's lives, gets them thinking, and they want more. And I'm looking long term also. I know, and I didn't know this writing my first book. I really thought I was writing my calling out card of a book. And I really thought that was going to be it, especially after you do it and you realize how hard it is to write a book. But really, because of the editor I worked with and how much I adored, after I wrote the first one, she said to me, you do know by now you're a serial author. I'm like, I kind of think I am. Like, I didn't go into this thinking I was going to be a serial author, but now there's absolutely a plan to put out a book every 3 years.
Yeah.
That's the momentum that works for me. But I'm also looking at as the whole ecosystem. You finish one book, as I'm looking at the second book, when I was looking at the second book, now I'm part of the reason why I'm in Connecticut for the month of August. I am beginning to work on the third book. But I'm looking at it as an ecosystem. Like, what does my audience need next? What's the
Mm.
next thing in their world that, particularly for this third book, I want to speak to the audience who's already following me, and I want to open it up to a much broader audience.
Mm.
So I think also if you choose to write multiple books, you can really serve the audience that you're writing for by looking at the whole of their lives and their ecosystem. One of my favorite authors, good, also really, really good friend, and I think does an ecosystem of books better than most, is Mike Michalowicz. Right? If you look at the
That he
suite,
had endorsed your book, and I actually just got his book, Get Different.
yeah,
And yeah, it's exceptional. I mean, you're
it
right.
is. He's amazing. But if you look at and he does a beautiful job on his website of having all, I think, 8 books now. And if you look, it's obvious all 8 books are written for the same person, if you will. And his motto and the philosophy he lives by is to eradicate entrepreneurial poverty. So everything he's writing from his most successful book, which is Profit First, which is the actual money financial system to eradicate entrepreneurial poverty. But all his books are connected. He's always expanding the audience, but he's also always addressing the next need of the
Mhm.
same audience. So I
Yeah.
think, as someone who now really gets that I'll be writing multiple books, I'm taking that very much into consideration, that I'm writing a whole ecosystem of books for an audience that will keep growing as well.
Yeah. It's exciting, right? It's really exciting because having the creativity as a photographer, right? Because that's definitely a highly creative profession. But, I've many potential authors who think that it's so difficult to write a book, or how do you get that many words out? And it's just another aspect of creativity. And so if they're creative in some area of their life, or they have experience in some way, that something that's easy for them now and used to be hard for them, then speak to those people who are still stuck in the hard place,
Yeah,
and
exactly. I mean,
that
it's
you
yeah, and
can serve
it's
those people. Yeah.
yep, exactly. And it's part telling your own story, but it's also because people, want to get into your own story and understand the lessons you've learned. And it's also knowing, like, I'm fully aware there are certain issues as a creative person's business. For example, in my photography business, I see a great number of the people I work with, clients that I work with, they really struggle with getting paid their value. They have a hard
Mm.
time, where from the time I was in my 20s, I was like, I had no problem charging top dollar. And I don't know why that is. Like, I just felt so strongly and saw the value in what I did. I had no problem charging whatever I felt I needed to charge for it. And I see other people. So you also can serve, like, I address that issue for people that have the issue, even though I never had the issue. But
Right.
because I know them so well, I know their
Yes.
lingo, I know they're having that issue.
Right.
So that to me is so much a part of writing a book, is just really knowing your reader,
Yes.
understanding what you need to do for them, whether it's something you directly have encountered or not. But as long as you understand their issues, you can also address those issues.
I love it. And, that is really at the end of the day, anyone writing a book, that is their goal, is to have a ecosystem, as you said, of work that's maybe books, courses, um, mentorships, coaching, whatever it is. It's that keeping your reader in mind.
Yeah.
We have people who bring manuscripts to us, and it's all about them, and it's getting you that shift from all about me to all about the reader.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit of a lesson, because the most important thing in our own world, right, is ourselves. Generally, most people talk about themselves, think about themselves, and to say, okay, I didn't have that problem
Yeah.
necessarily, but I understand my reader did.
Correct.
How can I address it? And I think that's so smart. And
Yeah.
it's such a gift to be able to give your reader something that's outside of your experience, but addresses theirs. So I've really appreciated you in this interview and all that you've shared. And I love what you're building. I love that you've taken your experience as a portrait photographer, and now you're helping the self-employed person to grow their business and to feel like you said, it's for those people who are working to make the living based on what they want
Yeah.
their life to look like. And what an important topic and group of people to serve.
I think so.
So
Pleased to do it.
what's the best way for people to get in touch with
Mhm.
you?
Sure. Well, my main website is jeffreyshaw.com. And almost everything I do that is connected to that website somehow. We did mention the Self-Employed Business Institute that has its own website, which is selfemployedbusinessinstitute.com. And that's my world. The podcast, everything. It's all, like you said, it's all connected. I was interviewed, as being introduced on a podcast the other day, and listening to somebody read your bio, the book, The Self-Employed Life, The Self-Employed Business Institute, The Self-Employed Life podcast. And he actually said, he goes, are you seeing a theme here? You realize that when you're building this ecosystem and you're so on brand that you kind of wonder, is it, but again, it's working when people contact me and say, I understand you're the self-employed guy. And I'm like, yep, that's it. So that to me is, honestly, if I look back at why did I write my first book, should anybody write a book? It's for platform, right? Own your space. You write the book that represents the reader you want to serve and the space that you want to take up. Elbow everybody else out of that space. Just decide on that to me is the core reason to write a book. And what I found motivated me is I wanted to own a space, and I would say the space I own, not just for self-employment, but it's a unique blend of business. The tagline of my podcast is business with a soul, right?
Yeah.
I teach business, it's personal development, and it's a hybrid that we don't commonly see in business books. But you read my business books, you also feel like you're receiving life coaching. And that to me it's a little bit of but that's my space. My people know me as a very soulful and strategic business owner.
Yeah. I get that vibe from you.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Because business is personal, especially when you're self-employed, you can't hide behind, some sort of other entity or defer to the boss somewhere else down in another department. It's like you are the end of the day. The buck does stop with you.
Yep. And your
So
heart is so connected with it. One of my core principles in the self-employed life is that your level of success is proportionate to your level of personal development. Like your business can't outgrow your belief in yourself or your belief in what you're capable of or your belief in what you deserve. Because if you've put a ceiling on what you think you deserve, you're not going to build a business that surpasses that ceiling. So therefore, you always have to grow yourself in order to increase the capacity of what your business can produce. So there's an inevitable connection between who you are as a person and your self-employed business.
yeah. And that's the blessing and the curse of it, I would say, because sometimes if you just think about, oh, if I just had a job where I could just go and do this task and fill this job description, I don't have to read all the self-help books maybe and do all the personal development work because you don't really have to face yourself as much.
Yeah.
But I feel like in the
as I,
self-employed world,
yep.
you can't escape yourself.
No. As I said to somebody in an email this morning, I was like, because they were, I think, 2 or 3 years into their business and, facing all the stuff. And I said it takes about 2 to 3 years before you realize you are now completely unemployable, right? You've stepped into being self-employed so much that you can't, you actually are unemployable. Like you can't go back to that job because you'll never be happy. Like there's so many, with all its challenges, I've never met a self-employed person that said they would have it any other way.
Right.
Once you step in far enough, even with the challenges, it's a pretty wonderful lifestyle for sure.
It really is. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. I will leave all of your information and the links in the show notes. Be sure to hop on over to jeffreyshaw.com, check out his books, read Lingo, read The Self-Employed Life, check in his podcast. And, we really appreciate you being here. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So this has been another episode of the iBook Podcast. I'm April O'Leary signing off. Be sure to hop on over to o'learypublishing.com to start your author adventure and see what writing a book could do for you in your profession, in your career, and what doors it might open. We thank our guests for being a part of the show today, and be sure to subscribe to podcasts here on YouTube. We look forward to serving you and helping you get your book out into the world.